In the late summer of 2012, a 55-year-old man lay in a hospital bed surrounded by his loved ones. The man was at a skilled nursing facility, recovering from a bad fall that had nearly killed him. Thankfully, now he was on the mend and things were looking good. But today, as the man looked around at the familiar faces of the people gathered by his bed, his eyes suddenly filled with terror. None of them were supposed to be here. The man squeezed his eyes shut in fear, and when he opened them a few seconds later, he breathed a sigh of relief. The friends and family were gone, and he was alone. The man leaned back on his pillow and shook his head. He knew he was just seeing things. He had been alone all along. But it was still disconcerting to have people pop in and out of his room like that. He did his best to relax and let it go, but then he caught a flash of movement in his peripheral vision, and his eyes went wide with fear once again. This time, it wasn't people appearing by his bedside. There was smoke coming through the walls, and the smoke was about to consume him. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, make sure to apologize to the follow button for all the tricks in the past, but when you lean in for a hug, steal a piece of their hair and plant it in all the evidence bags for every cold case file at your local police station. This episode is called Too Much of a Good Thing. At a popular diner in Waterbury, Connecticut, 52-year-old Gina Hale finished the last bites of her lasagna, being careful not to leave behind even a speck of the rich, delicious cheese. Across the table, her 55-year-old brother, Tony, downed his cheeseburger. This restaurant had been their hangout since they were kids, and whenever they came to this diner, where the old jukebox still had songs from the 1980s, it made them feel like they were teenagers again. From the moment they sat down on this July day in 2012, they were both wiping tears of laughter from their cheeks. Seeing Tony this happy made Gina smile. He'd been battling depression for a while now, and had finally gotten on the right antidepressants to help him feel like himself again. But as Gina watched Tony take a sip of his beer, she couldn't help but feel concerned. Now, with anybody else, a beer with lunch was no big deal, but Tony had abused alcohol for many years, and Gina couldn't hide her concern anymore. But Tony didn't even let Gina get a word out before he promised her this would be his last beer before he quit drinking cold turkey. Gina gave her brother a weak smile, trying hard not to remember all of his previous failed attempts at getting sober, which included 4 attempts at an actual rehab facility. She hoped this time it would stick, because all the drinking had really taken its toll on her brother. A little while later, when they got up to leave, Gina noticed that her brother was a bit slower than usual as he inched his way out of the booth. Out in the parking lot, Gina gave Tony a big hug as he hopped on his Harley and promised her he was okay to ride. He had the same brown eyes as their mother, and for a split second, it was like their mother's face flashed in front of Gina's eyes. Their mother had been an alcoholic too, and she eventually had died of cancer. And so as Gina watched her brother ride off down the street, she hoped he was not following in his mother's footsteps. Three weeks later, Gina broke a pane of glass at the back of her brother's house, then pried open the window and climbed inside. Gina hadn't heard from Tony in a few days. After their lunch they had together, he'd quit drinking cold turkey just as he'd promised. But it had not gone well. He'd been overcome by a condition called delirium tremens, which is when the body starts to shut down from alcohol withdrawal. Tony had been forced to spend an entire week in the hospital to recover, but he'd gotten through the worst of it, and Gina had hoped that this time he'd be able to stay sober. But now, it was clear something was wrong. Gina didn't know if Tony had gone into withdrawal again or maybe fallen off the wagon. But either way, he never just went radio silent like this. And now, looking around at the inside of his house, Gina knew it was bad. She crept through the rooms, calling her brother's name over and over, but there was no response. The unventilated house felt like an oven. As she wiped the sweat from her face, she looked at the dirty dishes and the overflowing garbage in the kitchen. She hadn't heard from Tony in days, and now, finding his home in this condition, she just couldn't stop the panic rising in her chest. Just then, a yellow streak flashed past her and she jumped. Her brother's tabby cat was suddenly at her feet, brushing up against her legs and yowling for attention. Gina could see that the cat's food dish was empty, and so she wondered why Tony hadn't fed his cat. As Gina was about to feed the cat just took off running down the hall and disappeared through the open door to the basement. Gina followed the cat down the hall, she turned to go down the stairs, she flipped on the basement light, and immediately she stopped. That's when she found her brother. Tony lay crumpled in a motionless heap down on the basement floor. Gina ran down the stairs to his side, and she could immediately tell he was badly hurt. His hair was matted with blood, his skin was a yellowish gray, and he had dark bruises all over his legs. Tony looked like he'd been lying there for a while, maybe even days. Gina pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. After she described what was going on, the dispatcher asked if Tony was breathing. Gina shakily replied that she couldn't tell. But just then, Tony's mouth opened and he began to cough. And as he gasped for air, his cracked, dry lips tried to form words. Gina begged the dispatcher to send help right away. After hanging up with the dispatcher, Gina took her brother's hand and leaned in close to hear what he was trying to say. But she couldn't make it out. He was just babbling something. And soon, his mysterious whispers were drowned out by the sounds of the ambulance pulling into the driveway. Three hours later, Gina sat down in the only seat left in the crowded ER waiting room, a tiny plastic chair in the kids' play area. As she sat there, she ate a bag of chips from the vending machine, wishing she had something more filling to eat. But mostly, she just couldn't stop thinking about the sight of her brother at the bottom of the basement stairs, his body twisted from the long fall. She really had thought Tony was dead, and she felt so grateful that he had a pulse when the EMTs finally reached him. Gina shifted uncomfortably in her chair for a few more minutes until the waiting room door swung open and a doctor finally called her name. Gina raced up to him, bracing for the worst. Tony was still alive, the doctor explained, but barely after his fall down the stairs. Tony had a severe concussion that may have damaged his brain, and he had suffered so much damage to his muscles in the fall that his kidneys had shut down. The doctor said he very likely would need dialysis, which is a process in which machines remove waste from the body when kidneys no longer function correctly. Even worse, Tony had suffered damage to his heart too, going into cardiac arrest in the ambulance. The paramedics had managed to restart his heart, but he was hanging on by a thread. Tony had gone comatose. To keep him alive, his doctors had put him on a ventilator to help him breathe and chilled his body temperature to 91.4 degrees to protect his brain. Gina asked if she could see her brother. The doctor nodded and said that Tony had been sent to the intensive care unit, but he warned her that Tony was in really bad shape, and so it wouldn't be easy to see him like that. Gina nodded and set off for the ICU. A few minutes later, the doctor's words were ringing in Gina's ears when the nurse on duty led her to her brother's door. But the sight of Tony still made Gina stifle a gasp. Her brother lay unconscious on the bed, covered in a pile of gel pads that were cooling his body. His swollen chest heaved up and down as the ventilator pumped oxygen down his throat and into his lungs, all while an IV line sent fluids and medicine into his body. Gina had never seen her big brother look so helpless. She walked up to him and touched his hand. It was cold and limp. Gina always knew Tony's alcohol abuse was going to hurt him if he didn't stop, but she never expected anything this bad. Five weeks later, Gina stepped into Tony's hospital room carrying an almost empty donut box. Tony had spent 3 weeks in the ICU and then 2 more weeks in a regular hospital room. And as those 5 weeks had passed, Gina had gotten to know every staff member in the wing. And she'd brought them donuts because today was a special day. Tony was finally well enough to move out of the hospital and into a skilled nursing facility. Tony's room was quiet now that many of the monitors and tubes had been disconnected, but he was still bedbound. He needed dialysis 3 times a week while doctors kept trying to save his kidneys, and the ventilator that had been breathing for him was now replaced by a hole in his throat with a tube sticking out, so oxygen could go straight to his lungs. Tony couldn't speak at all because of this tube, but through it all, he was somehow managing to hold up okay emotionally. Gina was genuinely impressed by his determination to get better. Gina sat down next to Tony's bed, looked into his eyes, and took his hand. It was warm and pink. and with great effort, he managed to give her a corny, exaggerated thumbs up. She knew instantly her brother was joking with her. Tony often mocked other people who gave the thumbs up gesture. Gina laughed and gave it right back to him. That was the brother she remembered and loved. Two weeks later, a nurse's aide named Matilda Rogers pulled her cart down the hallway inside of the skilled nursing facility where Tony was staying. Matilda really enjoyed the early shift. In the hours before the building got busy with deliveries and family visits, she had a chance to really connect with most of her patients and give them a little inspiration for the day. She stopped the cart and locked the wheels outside of Tony's room. Tony was one of her favorites. Matilda loved his sense of humor, and she developed a morning ritual of greeting him with a joke or a riddle. During his 2 weeks at the nursing center, Tony had learned to speak again by using a special valve on the hole in his throat. His voice was still raspy and low, but Matilda loved it when she could make him laugh. She also encouraged him to imitate her silly dance moves, and that helped him slowly strengthen his arms and legs, and so he had been making steady progress. But when Matilda stepped into Tony's room, armed with a new joke she'd gotten from her 11-year-old niece, Tony sat stone-faced and silent in the corner. Matilda instantly knew he was not in the mood for jokes this morning. Tony didn't say a word as she crushed his meds into a fine powder and administered them through his feeding tube. When she was done, she washed her hands and asked permission to sit in his guest chair so they could talk. He nodded, so she took a seat and then tried her joke, but Tony didn't respond. She asked if there was something going on that maybe he wanted to share. And eventually, Tony's eyes began to well up, and he would tell her something very strange. He told her in his slow, raspy voice that people from his past had been visiting him in his room. Old friends and family, including folks he hadn't seen for many years, had been suddenly appearing by his bedside. They would stand there and sometimes even speak to Tony for about 10 seconds, but then they would just disappear. Matilda asked him if he'd been having trouble sleeping again. She told him she thought he might have had a disturbing dream, but Tony was adamant that he had not been asleep at all. He said he knew that the people he was seeing in his room were not real, but he definitely was seeing them. It was not a dream. Matilda could see how frightened Tony was and told him she was going to do everything she could to keep him safe. She walked back into the hallway to the medicine cart, then pulled up her notes from the weekly meeting with the staff psychiatrist. She saw that Tony had been prescribed a new sleep medication a few days ago. Her notes from the night nurse said Tony had tolerated it well, and there were no indications that Tony had been suffering bad dreams or hallucinations. She couldn't understand why cheerful Tony had suddenly turned so dark. Matilda finished delivering meds to the rest of the patients along Tony's hallway and returned to Tony's room half an hour later to see how he was doing. His mood had not changed. In fact, he was even more argumentative and agitated. He insisted that 2 of his former co-workers had come to his bedside while she was gone. Matilda said it was too early for visitors, but Tony didn't even seem to hear her. Suddenly, he pointed across the room, his eyes wide, and told Matilda he saw a little girl trying to pick up a needle off the floor behind her. Matilda turned to look, and of course, there was no girl and no needle. That's when Matilda noted that Tony's face was flushed and he was breathing rapidly. When she checked his heart rate and blood pressure, she saw those too were rising. This was moving from perhaps just a bad dream to a potential emergency. Matilda asked the change nurse to call 911. 15 minutes later, she helped escort a flailing, agitated Tony, now strapped to a gurney, into an ambulance for an emergency room evaluation. Dr. Mary Shaughnessy was on duty in the ER when paramedics wheeled in a thrashing, confused Tony. The 35-year-old doctor quickly reviewed the notes sent over by the skilled nursing facility, so she knew that Tony had a host of medical issues, from his damaged heart and kidneys to his recent severe concussion. But the first place she looked for a clue about Tony's erratic behavior was the extensive list of medications he was taking. Dr. Shaughnessy noticed that he'd been taking an antidepressant for a few years, so that was nothing new. Many alcoholics suffer from depression, which is part of the reason they drink to excess. But the psychiatrist at the nursing facility had added a sleeping medication called Ambien just 4 days earlier. Dr. Shaughnessy knew that Ambien can actually cause delirium in some people, even at seemingly normal doses. Maybe that's what was going on with Tony. Dr. Shaughnessy called a psychiatrist to review Tony's blood work, and they agreed that the Ambien could be responsible for Tony's hallucinations. So they took Ambien off of Tony's medication list and sent him back to the nursing facility with a prescription for a different kind of sleep medication. 2 days later, when nurse's aide, Matilda Rogers, parked her medicine cart in front of Tony's room, she was hopeful that Tony was back to his upbeat, positive self. So she walked into Tony's room wearing a big smile, but she found him flopping and rolling around on the floor, gasping and yelling through the speaking valve on his throat. He was clearly having some kind of a seizure, and so Matilda immediately pressed the emergency call button. Matilda managed to get Tony to stop thrashing and tried to calm him down. Through his garbled cries, she could make out that he was clearly terrified that someone was coming to get him. He claimed that smoke was coming through the walls, and his wide eyes scanned the room constantly, looking for some unseen menace. A moment later, 2 staffers raced into the room to help get Tony back onto his bed, followed by the doctor who was on duty. Clearly, something dangerous was going on in Tony's head, and they needed to find out what it was immediately. The doctor asked Matilda to call for an ambulance to take Tony right back to the emergency room. 3 hours later, Dr. Shaughnessy reviewed Tony's lab results on a monitor next to his bed inside of the ER. Tony's sister, Gina, paced back and forth beside her. Gina had made it clear to Dr. Shaughnessy that she was not leaving until someone could explain to her what was going on with her brother. Dr. Shaughnessy wished she knew. Seeing Tony being wheeled back in from the nursing center 48 hours after she had discharged him was discouraging. It meant that her first guess must have been wrong. Maybe the Ambien sleeping pills were not causing Tony's problems after all. And there was no denying that Tony's condition had deteriorated. He couldn't tell Dr. Shaughnessy what day it was, or where he was, or where he had just come from. And not only was he more agitated, he now had a low-grade fever, and his heart was racing. In addition, his legs were swollen and they shook involuntarily when she manipulated his feet. All these signs suggested that Tony might have suffered some injury to his nervous system. Dr. Shaughnessy worried she might have missed something crucial the last time she saw Tony. She had ordered yet another round of scans and x-rays, plus the usual blood work and urinalysis. And all of the tests came back just like the last time, normal. All except the urinalysis. Dr. Shaughnessy explained to Gina that her brother's urine showed that he had contracted a serious urinary tract infection. This sort of infection is common among people who are bedridden, the doctor said, and it could explain Tony's delusions and paranoia. She said that severe UTIs can cause psychological symptoms as the body fights off the bacteria. But she said the good news was that urinary tract infections are completely treatable. Relief washed over Gina's face as Dr. Shaughnessy told her that she was going to admit Tony to the hospital. She was sure that a strong course of antibiotics would get him back on track. Two days later, an attending physician named Lucinda Bragg made her way to Tony's hospital room as she did rounds with her staff. As a senior physician, part of Dr. Bragg's job was to do rounds with the hospital interns and examine particularly challenging cases. And Tony's certainly fit the bill. So far, nobody had been able to figure out what was causing his hallucinations. Dr. Bragg hoped that this collective group might be able to come up with a new idea. As Dr. Bragg introduced herself and the group to Tony, she could see that he remained frightened and trembling, and the monitor showed that his blood pressure and heart rate remained elevated. Dr. Bragg explained to the staff that Tony was being treated for a urinary tract infection that doctors believed was causing the hallucinations. But after 2 days of treatment with strong antibiotics, Dr. Bragg said that Tony's UTI was getting better, but his mental state was not. Just then, Gina entered Tony's room. Dr. Bragg could immediately see the anxiety on Gina's face with all these people in the room, and so Dr. Bragg asked the other doctors to leave for a moment. After reassuring Gina that she was determined to help, Dr. Bragg took another look at Tony's medical history. Everything looked completely normal. There wasn't anything that stood out to her. But then, something occurred to Dr. Bragg. There was a very rare condition that she'd heard about, but had never actually personally treated. It was a condition that most doctors had never heard of, and was caused by something that few people would think could be harmful, let alone potentially fatal. From what Dr. Bragg remembered about it, This condition could cause hallucinations and confusion, affect heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature, and have a severe impact on muscle function. Basically, it explained all of Tony's symptoms, and if it was left untreated, it could be devastating. But before Dr. Bragg said anything about this to Gina, she wanted to get a second opinion. So Dr. Bragg excused herself to the hallway and tracked down a neurologist colleague. When Dr. Bragg told the neurologist about her suspicions, the neurologist could hardly believe it. But he double-checked Tony's charts, and from what he could tell, Dr. Bragg had finally found the answer. Tony and his doctors didn't know it, but he had been unknowingly overdosing on a potent chemical that plays a huge role in controlling our moods and feelings. It's called serotonin, and its primary job is to carry messages between nerves in the brain and throughout the body. But serotonin is best known for the way it improves mood. A whole industry has grown up around pills that stimulate the body's production of what many people call the feel-good chemical. And Tony's blood was flooded with it, to the point where it was causing his brain to go haywire and his body to shut down. This condition is called serotonin syndrome, and Tony was experiencing it because of a mix-up in his medications. When Tony was admitted to the skilled nursing facility, he was accidentally prescribed a second antidepressant. Antidepressants work by increasing the serotonin levels in the brain. But even a double dose of these antidepressants was not enough to trigger the adverse effects of serotonin syndrome. However, Tony was also prescribed yet another medication that can increase serotonin levels. This one was a treatment for his heartburn. And so it was this third medication on top of the double dose of antidepressants that combined to cause his serotonin syndrome. And so after the neurologist confirmed Dr. Bragg's diagnosis, Tony was taken off of those two antidepressants, and right away he made an incredible recovery.
In 1984, 19-year-old Timothy Molnar was living at home with his parents in Daytona Beach, Florida, while going to school for aeronautical mathematics. On January 24th, Timothy gets up and begins his day just like every other day of the work week, by going downstairs, having a bite to eat, and then taking his younger brother Frank to school. Once he dropped Frank off, he drove across town to his university where he had class, but as soon as he parked, he realized he had forgotten his bike, and that was something he'd brought with him everywhere. And so before class started, he went back home, he got his bike, put it in his car, turned around and headed out, and his mother would step outside and see him trailing away down the road, and that was the last time she, or anybody in their family for that matter, saw him alive. That night when Tim didn't come home, his family called the police. The police asked them, is there any reason he would want to run away? Is he in trouble? Is there anything going on? And his family's like, no, he's a straight A student. He's got lots of friends. He's super happy. He's well adjusted. He's on a great career path. There's nothing in his life to indicate that he would want to run away or that he's in trouble. I know he doesn't drink or do drugs. There's really nothing. So the police begin their investigation, and they start by looking at the family's credit card bills because they knew Tim had a credit card that was connected to the family account. And they found there had been a charge placed the same day he had gone missing in a gas station about 150 miles away. And so the police go out to this gas station and they find someone that had been there when Tim was there, and he was able to describe exactly what he looked like, what his car looked like. And the police ask him, was Tim alone? And the witness says, yeah, he was alone. He was acting totally normal. I saw him go into the store and then I saw him come back out again, and that was it. I don't know where he went after the gas station. So for the next couple of days, nothing really happened. There were no leads to operate on, and Tim wasn't getting in touch with them, so they just waited. Then on January 30th, so about a week after Tim has gone missing, Tim's family receives a letter from an auto impound company in Atlanta, Georgia. And the letter basically says, there is a car that's sitting in our lot that is registered to your house. You need to come out here and get it. And so the family goes to Atlanta, Georgia to inspect the car, and they walk up to it and there's nothing suspicious about it. There's no scratches on it. The tires are all fully inflated. They look inside and there's no sign of a struggle. There's no blood. There's no debris of any kind. But what they would find inside the car were Tim's credit cards, his wallet, his license, and other items suggesting that perhaps Tim is trying to ditch his old identity and start a new one. They also noticed a few very expensive items that they knew were always in his car were now missing. His car stereo, his toolbox, and his bike. Tim's family stayed in Atlanta for a couple of days thinking maybe Tim will return to this car, but after a couple of days it was clear that they weren't doing any good sitting there, so they went back to Florida. When they got back, they looked inside of Tim's room a little bit more closely and they discovered that none of his clothes had been taken. There was no suitcase taken. It was like he left with just the clothes on his back. They also checked his savings account and he had taken all the money out but left $10 in there. And the family believed that by leaving that $10, what he was really saying is, I'm going to come back someday. But he didn't come back, and they never ever heard about him again. It was like he just vanished. A decade after Tim went missing, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about Timothy and his disappearance in hopes that the viewers would be able to give them some information about the case. And sure enough, a man named Stephen Cull, who was living in Wisconsin, called into the show and said, without a doubt, I know where Timothy is. He told them this story about how 10 years earlier, he was walking around this forested area in Wisconsin when he came to a clearing in the middle of this forest, and he saw this lump in the middle of the ground. And he didn't know what it was. It was wintertime, so he couldn't tell if it was wood or an animal. And he walked up to it and he looked down and he realized it was this huge block of ice. And when he brushed the snow off the top, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Inside of this huge block of ice is the dead body of a young man. Cull would immediately call the police, who'd show up. They would get the body out of the ice, but there was no identifying information on him, and he was very badly decomposed at this point, and so they had no way to identify him, and so he was buried and he was unclaimed. But from the second Steve saw that dead body in the ice, that image was seared into his mind. And so when the TV show Unsolved Mysteries put a picture of Tim up on the screen saying, if you've seen this guy, let us know, Steven's like, oh my gosh, I recognize those clothes. That's the guy who was dead in the ice block. And so the police go to Wisconsin, they dig up the body that was inside of the ice, they do a DNA test, and sure enough, it's Tim Molnar. Even though Tim's body was almost completely skeletonized at this point, the coroner said there's no sign of trauma to his body. None. However, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. To this day, we have no idea how or why Tim wound up 1,200 miles away, frozen inside of a block of ice.
Our next story is called The Ultimate Shock. One morning in early June of 2011, in the Russian city of Kazan, a 49-year-old Russian woman named Fagiliu Mukhamatsonov woke up feeling nauseous. Fagiliu had recently had some health problems, and her doctors had told her that she really needed to take it easy, don't do anything that really stressed her out or made her mad, basically just relax. And so, on that morning, this is exactly what Fagiliu decided to do. Instead of pushing through her nausea to go to work anyways that day, she decided she would call out from work and stay home and have some tea and try to just feel better. But a little while later, when Fagiliu was in the kitchen making tea, her husband, Fagili, he came in and asked her how she was doing, and she said, you know what, I actually feel worse. My nausea has gotten worse, my chest hurts, and I'm starting to sweat. I'm gonna go lie down in the bedroom. But as Fagiliu walked across the kitchen to go lay down, her chest suddenly tightened tenfold, and she collapsed to the ground unconscious. Fagili rushed over to her and tried to wake her up, and when he couldn't, he rushed to the phone and dialed 112, which is Russia's emergency line, and he called for an ambulance. And then when the ambulance arrived, Fagiliu was not breathing. And by the time they got her to the hospital, she was declared dead. She had died from a heart attack. Fagili, who had been married to Fagiliu, his wife, for almost 30 years, was absolutely heartbroken, but he and his wife's religion encouraged people to have funerals within 24 hours of a loved one passing away. And so despite the fact that Fagili was basically despondent from all his grief, he pretty much immediately began calling relatives and friends and making preparations for Fagiliu's funeral, which would take place the next day. The next morning, Fagili woke up and put on his best suit, and then he joined his and his wife's family and friends at the funeral home for Fagiliu's funeral. When Fagili walked inside of the funeral home, he saw there were all these wooden chairs facing forward towards the front of the room, and at the front of the room, up on a table, was his wife's coffin, which was open and surrounded by all the flowers that Fagili had barely been able to buy with the little bit of money that he and his wife had. Fagili slowly made his way down the middle of the room to his wife's coffin, and the other people that were there saw him coming and got out of the way in respect to, the husband of the deceased. And so Fagili, he walks up and he looks down at his wife, who again, it's open casket so he can see her, and he was struck by her appearance. She just did not look right. Now, Fagili did not have enough money to embalm his wife, which means to preserve a dead body and make it look like it's very lifelike. And so instead, the people who worked in this funeral home had just applied heavy makeup to Fagiliu's face to try to make her appear more lifelike, but it really hadn't worked. To Fagili, it didn't even look like his wife. After all, Fagiliu never even wore makeup, and so to see her with heavy eyeliner and bright red lipstick was just totally bizarre. Behind Fagili, Fagiliu's relatives were all assembled in the first row, beginning their prayers for the dead. And so Fagili, after taking a few more looks at his wife, he stepped back and joined the first row. And so as Fagili was standing there holding his mother's and brother's hand, he closed his eyes and did his best to focus on the words of the prayer, instead of on the grief he was feeling for his wife. And as he was doing that, his mother, who was on his right side, suddenly broke from the words of the prayer and let out this strange crying sound. And Fagili, he opened his eyes and looked over at his mother, expecting her to be collapsed on the ground from all the grief she was experiencing. But instead, he saw his mother was trembling and looking straight ahead. And so Fagili followed her gaze, and what he saw at the front of the room made Fagili want to faint. His wife, Fagiliu, was now sitting straight up in her coffin. She wasn't making a sound, but she was looking out at the crowd of people with her strange makeup on her face, just staring at them with wide eyes. And for a second, everybody in the funeral home noticed this and went totally quiet, and both Fagiliu and the mourners just stared at each other. And then Fagiliu began screaming, but at first it was like she couldn't make any sound, and it was this raspy, dry yell that was coming out of her mouth, but then it built and built until it was sort of like a bellow or a roar. And when this loud, deep, guttural sound began coming out of Fagiliu's mouth, the mourners in the room began screaming too. And suddenly, it was absolute chaos inside of this building. As funeral workers rushed to call emergency services, not knowing what else to do, Fagili, who also had been screaming after seeing his wife arise from the dead, he kind of snapped out of it and ran to his wife, and he embraced her. And when he did, Fagiliu went from screaming to silent. And she looked up at her husband with wide, scared eyes and began crying, and then she slumped forward into Fagili's arms. At this point, Fagili's family and Fagiliu's family saw what was happening, and they kind of snapped out of it too, and they rushed forward, and they helped Fagili lift Fagiliu out of her coffin, and they laid her down on the ground. And even though she wasn't moving, her eyes were open, and she was looking up at her family, just absolutely terrified, with all her makeup running from her tears. And then 12 minutes later, when Fagiliu finally was rushed to the hospital, she was declared dead again. It would turn out that when Fagiliu collapsed on her kitchen floor, she really did have a heart attack, but it didn't kill her. She was just unconscious, and her breathing was very shallow, and she wasn't moving, and nobody noticed. And so when Fagiliu kind of came to and woke up inside of her coffin at her funeral, she likely was okay, all things considered. She was, healthy enough to be alive. But when she looked around the room and saw she was at her own funeral and sitting in her coffin, the stress of that moment had given her another heart attack. And this one had been fatal. The next and final story of today's episode is called Headache. On the afternoon of May 25th, 2017, 42-year-old Nicole Gordon was laying on her couch in her home in Atlanta, Georgia, with an ice pack on her head. She had a blinding headache, one of the worst headaches she had ever had, and she was just unable to do anything else but lay on the couch. Nicole really had no idea why she had this terrible headache. The only thing she could think of was 3 weeks earlier, she had been in a minor car accident and one of her car windows had broken and some of the glass had cut her face, but she didn't think that would be enough to lead to this absolutely horrific headache that had not gone away for 3 weeks. But Nicole was a very tough woman, and even though she had thought about going to the hospital over these past 3 weeks to deal with whatever was causing this headache, she had told herself that, it's gotta be something minor, I just need to kind of tough it out here. And what toughing it out looked like was laying on the couch all day long, only getting up to eat and go to the bathroom, not going to work, and just sitting in the darkness with this ice pack, just hoping for this headache to go away. And so as Nicole was just laying there, she heard her back door open up. It was her boyfriend, Geronte, coming in with groceries. He came inside and he put the groceries away, and then he came into the living room where she was and he asked how she was doing. And she told him that the headache had not gone away yet, and would he mind going into the kitchen and getting her some ibuprofen, which are pain meds, as well as some water. And so Geronte said, of course. He went in the kitchen. He got what she needed. He brought it back. She said, thank you. She took the ibuprofen, and then she went back to just being totally miserable. But just a second later, Nicole and Geronte heard a knock at the front door, and Geronte, he walked over and kind of casually looked through the blinds to see if he could see who was at the front door, and he saw it was Nicole's best friend, Leisha. But instead of going to the door and opening it, Geronte turned to Nicole and said, hey, it's Leisha. Do you want me to get the door? And Nicole, she just kind of grunted and said, no, please just ignore her. Even though Nicole and Leisha were very close, Nicole knew that Leisha was very high energy. She had been calling and texting basically nonstop ever since Nicole had begun getting these headaches. Leisha just wanted to help and kind of be around and be a part of her recovery. But Nicole just couldn't deal with that super high energy right now. She could barely have a conversation without her head hurting even more. And she knew that Leisha and Geronte didn't really get along too well. And so Nicole figured it would just be better for everybody if they pretended no one was home and Leisha just went on her merry way. But Leisha was very persistent and just continued knocking really loud on the front door. She began calling Nicole's phone, and so Nicole began reaching over and silencing her phone over and over again. And finally, Nicole looked over at Geronte and just said, I don't need this. I'm going into my bedroom and I'm lying down. And so she grabbed her phone, she stood up off the couch, she could barely move, her head hurt so bad, and she walked, quietly past the front door, made her way into her bedroom, and she was about to lay down on the bed when she made the mistake of opening up her blinds just a little bit. Her room was on the front of the house as well, and she wanted to see if Leisha was still there. And when she opened those blinds, Leisha, who was outside, happened to be looking at Nicole's bedroom, and the two of them made eye contact, and Nicole's like, oh my God, she knows I'm here. And so Nicole, she just shuts the blinds, but now Leisha comes up to the window and she's yelling, Nicole, I know you're there. Come on, let me in. I want to help you. But Nicole, she just could not deal with it, and so she laid down on her bed and just continued to totally ignore Leisha. Nicole knew that no matter how offended and upset Leisha was for this snub, she would get over it because the two women had been friends for nearly 2 decades. 19 years earlier, they had been neighbors and they had become friends really quickly. They had been pregnant at the same time and they began raising their kids kind of like side by side. But in the last 5 years that Nicole and Geronte had been together, Nicole and Leisha had kind of drifted apart because Leisha and Geronte both had very strong personalities and they just kind of clashed. And Nicole and Geronte had this kind of on-again, off-again relationship, and every time they were broken up, Leisha would come around and be totally unfiltered with Nicole about how much she didn't like Geronte. But right now, Nicole could just not deal with Leisha, and so despite hearing her yelling for her to come outside, come on, I know you're in there, Nicole just rolled over on her bed with her ice pack on the side of her head, and she fell asleep. A few hours later, when Nicole woke up, Leisha was gone, as well as Geronte. He didn't stick around for very long. He often would only come over just to check in, and then he'd go off and do his own thing. And so Nicole, who still had this blinding headache, she sat up, she got out of her bed, and she was only able to walk back out into the living room where she laid down on the couch and just went right back to sleep. Even though Nicole had had this headache for 3 weeks and it had not gotten any better, she really was convinced that taking enough ibuprofen and relaxing long enough would cause it to go away. But over the next couple of days, this headache, which was already like a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale to Nicole, somehow became like a 20 out of 10, and it got so bad that she couldn't even open her eyes. It was like horrific. And as this headache got so bad, her relationship with Geronte started to sour. Geronte didn't really believe that Nicole was actually in the amount of pain that she was in, and he kind of began acting like she was just being lazy. And this really upset Nicole because that wasn't true at all. She was just in blinding pain and couldn't do anything. Finally, in late June, so 5 weeks after Nicole's headaches had begun, and at this point, her headache had still not gone away, she was laying on the couch, like always, with the lights off, she's got the ice pack on her head, and she's just trying to get through the day when she hears the back door open, and it's Geronte, and he comes in, he slams the back door, he doesn't even say hello, and he just storms into the living room and just looks down at her with a totally disapproving look. And Nicole, she kind of looked over at him, and when she saw that look on his face, she had just had it, and she said, "You know what? We're done." And immediately Geronte got so mad, and he's like, "How dare you? I've been taking care of you for the past 5 weeks, bringing you groceries, this and that." And Nicole, she had no energy to fight with him, and so she just let him rant and rave until finally he was done, and he walked out, and she was like, "Thank goodness." A few days later, on June 25th, Leisha was back at Nicole's house knocking on the door. Nicole had actually texted her to let her know that she had officially ended things with Geronte, and so feel free to come over, there's not going to be any drama with him being here. And so Leisha had come back over. She was very excited to see Nicole and kind of get over the snafu of her being ignored. And when she knocked, Nicole did go up to the door and she opened it up. And Leisha, as soon as she saw Nicole, this is like the first time she's seeing her since Nicole's headaches had really begun, she knew something was definitely wrong with Nicole. Her entire apartment is totally dark, all the windows are covered up, and Nicole is squinting out at Leisha, kind of beckoning her to come inside. And Leisha's like, "Oh my gosh, like how bad is this headache?" And Nicole could barely make a sentence, and she just said, "Oh, it's so bad, it's so bad." And so Leisha came inside, and Nicole led her through the dark apartment to the kitchen and back. And Nicole, she sat down, and Leisha sat down opposite her. And Leisha began asking Nicole questions about her headache, about Geronte, just kind of about her life. And quickly, Leisha realized that Nicole really wasn't making any sense. Her answers, even to the simplest questions like, "What did you eat today?" were in fragments and didn't really make any sense. And finally, Leisha said to Nicole, "Hey, this can't be a normal headache. This is something serious. You need to go to the hospital." And at this point, even though Nicole had been trying so hard to just kind of white knuckle her way through whatever was going on in hopes it would go away, she was starting to realize that there was something wrong here and she needed help from a doctor. And so Nicole agreed to go. And so Leisha would help Nicole up and kind of assist her out of the apartment and into Leisha's car, and Leisha would take her to the hospital. And when they got there, Leisha brought Nicole into the emergency room, and she explained to the nurses and doctors that Nicole had this terrible migraine. It started after she was in this minor car accident 5 weeks earlier. And so the doctors and nurses brought Nicole back to one of the rooms, and they began kind of treating her the way they would any other patient who had a serious headache. They asked her if she was hydrated. They asked what medication she was taking. They asked her what she was eating, how much sleep she was getting. They were just kind of going down the list of different things that could cause this headache, but nothing stood out as a red flag. Even the fact that she had been in this minor car accident and had some cuts on her face from the glass, that really wasn't enough for them to think, oh yeah, that would cause 5 weeks of a persistent migraine-like headache. They even looked at the cuts on her face to see if maybe they were infected or something, but they weren't. Basically, they had no idea what was causing this. But the doctors and nurses were very concerned because persistent, extreme pain in your head could be signs of a stroke or an aneurysm or something, both of which can be fatal. So they put Nicole through a series of imaging scans to get a look inside of her head to try to figure out what was going on. And after they finished all these scans, Nicole was brought back to her hospital room and she laid down on the bed. And even though she felt terrible still because of this headache, she at least felt like, okay, finally, these people are going to figure out what's wrong with me. They're going to give me medication. This headache's going to go away and I can get back to my normal life. But only a few minutes later, as Nicole is laying there trying to get comfortable, the door to her room suddenly burst open and a swarm of people came into the room looking very concerned. And in the middle of all these people was a guy wearing a suit, and he walked up to Nicole and he said he was a police detective, and he held up one of her scans and he pointed at it. But to understand what he was pointing at on her scan, we need to go back and look at what really happened on the day that Nicole got into that minor car accident. Back in early May of 2017, Nicole and Durante, who were still dating at this point, had just come back to Nicole's house after the two of them had been at a house party together. And Nicole was furious with Durante because at this house party, he had been openly flirting with another woman right in front of Nicole. And so Nicole, after going into her house, brought it up to Durante about how disrespectful that was. And Durante, instead of being apologetic or trying to defend himself or even lie about it, he actually just got really mad at Nicole and said, you know what, fine, I'm breaking up with you. And then he began going around her house, gathering up all of his things that he had left inside of her house. And Nicole, truthfully, was so mad that she didn't really care that he was putting on this show of taking his stuff and leaving her. And so after a few minutes of Durante angrily grabbing his stuff from inside the house, he headed outside to Nicole's car where he had some more things inside of her car. And so he went in the passenger seat, and Nicole, she just reflexively got into the driver's seat of the car just to make sure that Durante didn't take anything inside of her car that he shouldn't, or mess with her car in some way to get revenge on her. And so she's sitting there, she's watching Durante right next to her, gather up his things, and then he hops out of the car, doesn't say a word to her, and then he walked around the front of her car and got into his car, which was parked right in front of hers, facing out towards the road. He climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and then he didn't move. And so Nicole, she's still sitting in her car, looking at Durante, hoping that he's just gonna leave now, but he wasn't. And so suddenly feeling so frustrated and mad at him for everything, she turned on her car and drove forward, not fast or anything, and bumped intentionally into the back of Durante's car, and then she backed up to where she had been. And after she did that, she stared angrily at Durante, basically being like, what? Like, I want you to leave, like, get out of here. And Durante, he was furious. And so he threw his car in reverse and he really hit the gas and rammed into the front of Nicole's car. And in fact, he hit her car so hard that her car lurched backwards and smashed into her fence. Now, Nicole's memory only showed her this exchange. She remembered fighting with Durante, him getting his stuff, and then her bumping into him, and then him really hard smashing into her. And so when she thought about the minor accident she had gotten into, this was it. But what Nicole did not know as she was laying in the hospital bed, as this detective is holding up the scan and pointing at it, is there was actually a whole other series of events that played out after Durante backed into her. After Durante backed into Nicole and she smashed into her fence, Durante got out of his car, walked up to Nicole's car, drew a gun, and shot Nicole in the head. That's what happened. This was not a glass cut. This mark on her forehead was where the bullet went into her skull. But obviously, this did not kill Nicole. It knocked her unconscious, and Durante picked her up, put her in his car, and drove her to his mother's house, where he told his mother that, oh, Nicole was drunk and she got into a small accident and, she just needs to rest. And so Durante's mom, believing her son, put some Neosporin on Nicole's entry wound from the gunshot, put a Band-Aid over it, and kind of looked after her for the night. And then when Nicole came to, she had no idea what happened. Her memory only existed up until Durante rammed into her. She didn't remember him getting out and shooting her and all of that. And so when Durante realized that Nicole didn't know he shot her, he just went along with it and said, oh yeah, you got drunk and, we were fighting a little bit and you got into a small accident and I think the glass fell down and cut your head. That's all that happened. And Nicole believed it.
It wasn't until Leisha made Nicole go to the hospital 5 weeks later and they scanned her head that they discovered a bullet lodged in her brain. And so the detective came in the room holding up the scan and he pointed to the bright spot on the scan, and that was the bullet. And the doctors and nurses, they told Nicole that we've never seen anything like this, like you should be dead. And also, because this has gone untreated for 5 weeks, your body healed around the bullet. Like, we can't even take it out now. Your brain has formed itself around the bullet. And so it will do more damage than good if we try to pull it out. And so Nicole would go on to live her life with this bullet in her head, but she never really fully recovered. As for Durante, the police would very quickly go after him, but he would flee police and evade them for 2 years. And then finally, when they caught up to him, he was hiding in an attic and there was this whole long standoff. But then finally he would surrender himself, and then he would get charged with a host of crimes, many of which he was convicted of. And so ultimately he was sentenced to 25 years in prison.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts: MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel.